大家好，我是安大雄。很多焦虑症的朋友都看过《焦虑症的自救》这本书。之前我也在视频中给大家分享过自己的读书心得。这本书的作者克莱尔维克斯医生，他用很简单、很通俗的语言讲述了焦虑症的原理，告诉我们去如何应对焦虑，也就是面对、接受、飘然、等待的4个步骤。最近，根据一位网友提供的信息，我找到了1983年英国广播公司 BBC 对克莱尔维克斯医生的电视采访。那个时候维克斯医生已经80岁的高龄了。虽然这个采访已经快过去30年了，但现在再看，依然对我们很有启发。那这次采访一共分了6次，加起来一共是1个小时。我先把里面的一些精华的内容根据不同的主题挑选出来，加上中文字幕，一个一个发出来给大家看。最后呢，我再发完整版的采访内容。那现在就让我们把时间推回到1983年。
The subject today is the anxiety state, Doctor, and is that the crux of the whole problem of nervous illness?
It's the commonest kind of nervous illness, Marion, the anxiety state. It really means a person who is, one could say, possessed with anxiety, which turns to fear. In my experience, there are 2 kinds. There's the person whose anxiety state has come about because of some problem, some sorrow or guilt, disgrace. And there's the other person who has been put under stress, perhaps by some sudden stress, say a severe hemorrhage, or continuous stress, such as living with a domestic problem. And as a doctor, I found that the vast majority had no specific problem. They had become afraid of the state they were in. And to understand that, we have to understand that our nervous system has 2 main parts. One we call voluntary, and we can move it as we will. The other is involuntary. It controls the functioning of our organs and the registering of our emotions. Now, when under stress, emotions are registered, maybe at first simply, as one would normally experience them. Gradually, as stress progresses, the registering of the emotion becomes exaggerated. And we say that our nerves are aroused. And this can be a very painful experience. It means that an ordinary spasm of fear becomes a flash of panic. Just feeling a heartbeat becomes a consciousness of a bang, 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 bang. Or, as the patient says, missed heartbeats. Churning stomach, inability to swallow, to take in a deep breath, a feeling of weakness, almost fainting. Now, these are difficult, upsetting symptoms to live with. And they are the symptoms of stress. Now, the sufferer invariably makes the mistake of adding more stress, becoming afraid of those symptoms. And he doesn't understand them, so he adds stress to stress. And he's in a cycle. The stress originally, through the hemorrhage, whatever it was, the stress of his fear, more stress symptoms, and there you have the cycle turning, and through that comes what I call not so much arousal, that's the scientific term, but sensitization. The first thing to do to help the patient reverse that cycle, it was simple, its development was simple, the cure is simple too. I didn't say easy, I said simple, is to give him understanding of the symptoms. Yes?
I was going to say, how effective is that understanding? Do you find that people respond to that quickly?
Some do, some don't. One woman just had 1 visit, and she was completely cured. She came back, she said, it's gone, I can't panic. No matter what I do, I went to the top of the AMP, but I can't panic. 1 visit with understanding cured her. But most people, the understanding has to be helped with a program for recovery. But can I explain to you just how complicated some of these symptoms can seem? You take the trembling hand, and when a person under great stress finds that their hand finally is beginning to tremble, they think well, that's the sign of a great deterioration. They must be getting organically really involved now. They're in for some really illness, you know. That's you're losing control, old fellow, you're losing control. But actually, it can be explained as simply as the knee jerk. If you tap a person's knee and the leg extends, that is because in the tendon of the muscle there is a spindle that sends a message to the spine and back and says jerk, like that. In the muscles of the fingers there are muscle spindles, those are nerve endings, which do the same to the muscle. Those muscle spindles are acted on by adrenaline, which is one of the stress hormones, liberated by the part of the nervous system that controls the organs and the emotions. It stimulates the muscle spindles that send the same message back to the spinal cord, back to the fingers, and the muscles extend. So that is no more than a series of little finger jerks, and nothing to be afraid of. Let it jerk.
Can you control them?
Eventually, through accepting them. You see, I have to teach what to do. Explanation is not always enough. I teach facing, accepting, floating, and letting time pass. Now, facing, I'll give you an example of that. A very good example of how a man did not face and what happened. He was a Canadian, and he belonged to a group who taught that to overcome the fear of going out, one had to go as far as one could without panicking and then return. If one panicked, return straight away. And in this way, he did get used to travelling round the little village. Eventually, he went to Las Vegas and back, had a fortnight, and he didn't panic once. And he came back to Vancouver. He lived just outside Vancouver. And the next day he had to go to the bank. But when he went into the queue, waiting for the bank, for the teller, and handed him the same bank book, the same teller, and stood on the same spot where he had panicked so often before, he panicked again, and it was a smasher. And he thought, what will I do now? I've had 18 months practicing getting used to. I've been to America, and I didn't panic. But now I panic, and it's worse than ever. You see, he had never faced the symptoms. He'd never learned how to cope them. He never learned that when you panic, you let your body relax and you let the waves sweep all over you. You see it right through. Panic is an electric flash. It's a superficial electric flash. And that I teach my patients, to go toward it, let it come, let everything happen to the body that will, with utter acceptance. We're changing the mood. We're reversing the pattern. From going into fear, we're going into losing fear through getting used to the actual symptoms, not used to the place. So that in the end, even though the panic flash may still come, and it probably will, it no longer matters as much. It's the no longer mattering that is the key. I teach them that these things no longer matter. And they have to have the doctor who's going to help them with this, or the books, to give them the courage to see it right through. So often, just at the climax of the panic or the symptom, they withdraw. And that's tension, that's more adrenaline, that's more stress hormone, and that is an even stronger experiencing of the symptom. It's utter acceptance, letting it come, even going toward, going out prepared to take what will come. Let one's body do what it wants to do. Don't check it, don't try not to panic, don't think of something else. Into it willingly, just as in Australia, when the big waves come, we don't stand up against them. We get dumped if we do. We go under them willingly. That's accepting and facing.
It's almost like tranquilizing yourself.
Yes, yes, it is.
Rather than taking a tranquilizer.
Well, there is a place for tranquilization. I know a lot has been written about tranquilizers recently, especially. There is a place. Some people are so sensitized that it is almost beyond their capacity to go into panic, go into the symptoms, and accept utterly. I said almost. There are people who will not take tranquilizers and who do and who can. But I never ask that of my patients. Those who will, I support, and I think good on you. But those who need tranquilization, I see that they get it at that stage in two ways. They get enough but not too much. I still want them to feel enough panic to know that they have to practice facing and accepting and floating. And then there are times when they're so utterly worn out with practicing that they need a rest from it for a little while. And tranquilizers, perhaps just for one day, will give them that rest. Tranquilizers must be watched by the doctor. And floating is such an excellent word, really. You see, it implies more than relaxation. It is relaxation with action. You take an agoraphobic person who's afraid to walk to the supermarket. He can become so rooted to the ground with tension that he feels he can't make one step forward, and he does the very worst that he can do. He tries to force. I will go, I'll get there, I'll get there. And the more he does that, the more tension, and the more he locks himself in action. Now, if he were to let his body go utterly and think, float, float, don't fight, float. The very thought of floating unlocks the muscles. And in that way, he can float forward. He can float through a difficult situation. He can float through a situation at work of having to meet a boss, of having to meet situations that really get him down. I'm not going to stand up to this. I'm going under it. I'm going to float through it.
So you're saying then that you can use this method for both anxiety states, because you said there were two types.
That's
and
right.
You talked mainly about the one where people had got into
Yes.
this vicious circle. But even for the person who does have a positive physical problem, they can still use that technique?
Yes, oh, definitely, in two ways. Because, first of all, they will eventually become afraid of their symptoms also. They'll be afraid of their so-called missing heartbeats and afraid of their thumping heart and their iron bad headache. They'll be afraid of those while they're contemplating their problem. But if they understand what they are, if they understand that the thumping heart is no more than the extra beat of a normal heart, I'm assuming they've been examined by their doctor, that takes some of the misery away so that they can more peacefully contemplate their problem and perhaps arrive at a solution.